So, we have started this study over the next few weeks. Can you hear me okay with that, Hazel? No. So we've been doing this study over the last few weeks about how God's heart is revealed in the Old Testament. Because it's very easy to see the Old and the New Testament as two versions of God. In many ways, it's easy for us to look at the Old Testament and go, that was the angry, smiting God in the Old Testament, who destroyed families and all sorts of things, and struck people down with lightning and afflicted them with all sorts of diseases, but who also appeared in pillars of fire and smoke. And then in the New Testament, we see the human face God, Jesus, and how Jesus was warm and cuddly and never said anything challenging. Well, he did, he said lots of incredibly challenging things. But sometimes we kind of have this disparity between the way that we understand, or we can understand God. And we think that maybe God changed the way that he was perceived by humankind when he came in the form of Jesus. But actually, it's simply not true. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God of the Old Testament is exactly the same as the God in the New Testament. It's just that we've understood it differently. It's just that we have to maybe dig a little bit more deeply into the Old Testament to try and understand. So how do we bring the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament together? Because actually, we are one God, they're the same person. So we're looking at how God's heart is revealed as we understand it in the New Testament through the stories of the Old Testament. All right. So let's see. Point. Who could have who we covered so far? Noah. That's right. Yes. Abraham. Yeah, that's right. Everybody was listening to this. All right. So this week we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph, made famous by Andrew Lloyd Webber. So we're going to be singing it. No, we're not. Don't worry. So I'm going to. It'd be good for you to have your Bible because we're going to do a pretty comprehensive run through of the whole of the story of Joseph. So Joseph. Does anybody know where Joseph comes in the Bible? Genesis chapter 37, very good, all right. And the story of Joseph finishes in chapter, come on, she's trying to remember, turning pages helps her.
42-ish?
And no, the story of Joseph goes all the way through to the end of Genesis. Yeah, so verses 37 to 50 is the story of Joseph, because the story of Joseph is really, really important. Okay? We can't underestimate the importance of the story of Joseph. Because if Joseph hadn't ended up in Egypt, and his family hadn't ever ended up coming to be with him, then the children of Israel would never have been, they'd never have been kind of victimized by Pharaoh and led out by Moses, and they would have never gone on the great Exodus. And if they'd never gone on the great Exodus, they would have never have gone into the promised land. There would never have been 12 tribes of Israel, because that's one of Joseph's brothers. They were the 12 tribes. They fathered the 12 tribes of Israel, and if we hadn't had 12 tribes of Israel, we wouldn't have had the likes of Boaz, and of course, if the children hadn't been in the wilderness on the Exodus out of Egypt and trying to find the promised land, they would not have gone to Jericho. And if they hadn't gone to Jericho, they wouldn't have met a prostitute called Rahab. And if they hadn't have saved Rahab, and then Rahab then got married to an Israelite, we wouldn't have Jesus. Because there's Rahab, and there's Ruth, and there's Boaz, and eventually you get all the way down, you get David. King David comes along, and then much further down the line, eventually, you get to Joseph, and we end up with Jesus. So, the story of Joseph is really like the precursor to everything else. You've done all of the creation events, all of that sort of thing. That's really that's the prequel. Now we're in Joseph, and we're just kind of finishing that prequel. We're setting the scene. We're making sure that the children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, find their way to Egypt, because they need to be in Egypt, because God has some amazing plans. So, the story we need to make sure that we understand the importance of the story of Joseph to the whole narrative of the Bible. Without Joseph, there is no rest of the Bible. And that's how important he is. Okay. So we go from Genesis 37 all the way through to 15. I thought if we just read every other verse, we should get through it by lunchtime. What we'll do is we'll just kind of skip around it a little bit and just kind of remind ourselves of the story. And maybe if you know the Joseph musical, you can hum the tunes in your head as we read the scriptures. All right, so let's start in chapter 37, verses 1 to 3. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that the father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Doesn't set the story up great, does it? Now, as parents, we're not supposed to have favourites, right? In fact, it's positively unhealthy for us to have favourite children, all right? But Jacob, let's be honest, Jacob's not too bright anyway, because Jacob tried to wrestle with an angel and lost. So Jacob hasn't really learned, he doesn't have a lot of common sense, and decides that he's going to make Joseph his favourite son. See, not only does he make Joseph his favourite son, he does something that's really, really a huge slap in the face to his older brothers. He has a coat made to him. It's a coat of many colours. Isn't it red and yellow and green and black and all of them? You know the song maybe. So it's a beautiful coat, right? But it's not just a fancy coat that Jacob gives to Joseph. Because, like, as with everything back in those days, it was absolutely loaded with meaning. Now, it wasn't the colours that particularly had that much meaning. It was the fact that his father had given him this special coat. Because, back in those days, only the boss of the family and only his chosen heir, who was going to take over the family, would wear a coat. Because if you wore a coat, it meant that you weren't out walking too much in the fields because you didn't want to spoil your coat. That you were there on official business only because then you could wear your coat without it being spoiled by having to shovel mud or collect water, all of that sort of thing. So you can imagine Joseph has several older brothers. And I guess the eldest brother is thinking, when's Dad going to give me the coat so that I can start to learn the trade, so that I can take over the family when Dad dies? And he sees that Dad's sent out to the tailors and he's had this amazing coat made, and he's like, looking a little bit small for me, Dad. And then, last minute, his 17-year-old little upstart of a brother turns up wearing the coat. That's a real slap in the face. No wonder his brothers hated him. Put in the fact that he's 17. Now, any of us who are parenting teenagers know teenagers can be challenging. And then Joseph, of course, starts to get a bit big for his boots. He starts to talk about all sorts of dreams that he's had. That the sun, the moon, and the stars were bowing down to him, and that sheaves of corn were bowing down to his sheaf of corn, and all of this sort of thing. Before you know it, it's no wonder Joseph got really, really unpopular. And of course, they're not just talking about unpopular, are they? His brothers saw that his father loved him, and they hated him. The Bible doesn't mince words. If it says that he hated him, it's not like when siblings fight, "No, I hate you." No, this is a genuine hate. And as we see, as the story unfolds, his brothers genuinely do hate him. Because he's stolen their birthright. He's made their life a complete and utter misery. They're out having to sort out the sheep, while Joseph is swanning around wearing a fancy coat given to him by his dad. So, they hatch this plan. So we're going to do a quick move forward in the story. So chapter 30, so a bit further on in chapter 37, verses 31 to 33, say this. Joseph has gone to check up on his brothers. His brothers have beaten him up, chucked him down a well, not sure what to do with him, and they've sold him into slavery. That's just what you do with a snotty little 17-year-old brother. You sell him into slavery. I told you that they hated him. So they got Joseph's robe, the fancy coat that his dad bought him, slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father, and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. These guys are a piece of work, right? They beat him up, throw him down a well, sell him into slavery, like as Richard was talking a little bit about slavery earlier, completely stripping him of any human rights he may have at all. He becomes a possession that they sell. They must have known that it would end in certain death for him, that he would live a few years, catch cholera or something like that and die in some horrible hovel somewhere. Right? And they did that without even thinking about it. Then they have the audacity to concoct this incredible story. They take his robe, that thing that caused them so much pain and offence. They kill a goat, dip the robe in his blood, in this goat's blood, and take it to their dad. And you see, they don't actually lie. They don't lie as much as we think they do. They tell a half-truth. We found this robe and it has some blood on. Have a look and see if it's Joseph's. And of course, Dad says it is Joseph. And then Dad, Jacob, draws the conclusion, oh, my son's been ripped to shreds. And then they do the absolute worst, and they come round their dad and go, Dad, I'm so sorry. And I imagine they wept with him. And, they really do a complete and utter job, not only on Joseph, but on their dad. They put their dad through the most horrible pain that any parent could ever imagine going through. And that's the loss, the murder of a child. The tragic death of a child. And they stand by and they watch their dad mourn for the rest of his life. So these guys are they beat their brother up, send him into slavery, and they inflict the worst kind of pain on their father that they could ever imagine. These guys are not nice whatsoever. But somehow, Joseph makes it through. Joseph gets sent to Potiphar. And if we look on a little bit further, if we go into chapter 39, verses 2 to 4, the Lord was with Joseph. It's amazing, right? Despite what was happening, God continued to be with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my troubles and all my father's household." And the second son The Lord has given him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. So, Joseph is a bit like a cat, always landing on his feet. Although that's probably a bit unfair to Joseph. He's probably had to encounter a long walk to Egypt in chains, probably been whipped, beaten up, dehumanized. He's had to suffer the indignity of being sold in a market, like a sheep or a cow. He's been bought, but God's with him, and he prospers. And Potiphar puts him in charge of everything, basically entrusts his whole life to him. So Joseph must be thinking at this point that everything's good. Phew. At least I'm not the lowest of the low, and actually things are going quite well. But then, in verses 11 to 20, things go horribly wrong for Joseph again. One day he went to the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. Potiphar's wife caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to him, "this Hebrew has been brought here to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." And then, of course, we see what happens. She goes, tells her husband, Joseph tried to attack me, he tried to rape me. Look, I have proof. And then Potiphar does what every husband, I guess, would do in a similar situation. Has him thrown in jail. And Joseph finds himself back to square one yet again. Can you kind of see how Joseph's life kind of goes peaks and troughs. The peaks are very high, and the troughs are very low. Dad's favourite, sold into slavery. Potiphar's number one, accused of rape, in jail. Things are not happy at all for Joseph. But his story continues. So in verses, in chapter 14, verses 14 and 15, we see that in his jail cell he's joined by the baker and the cupbearer. And somehow Joseph has managed to keep his faith in God going. And they tell him about these awful dreams that he's had, and he says, my God, I can ask God what these dreams mean. And he gives the interpretation to the dream. One of them gets happy news, one of them gets sad news. Joseph is absolutely spot on. And Joseph is the hero of the day, yet again. And Joseph must be thinking, right, the word is out there that I'm a good guy, I can interpret dreams, but verse 23 of chapter 14 says this: the cupbearer who got the happy news went back to Pharaoh. The cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Wow. Can you imagine being in that situation, doing something amazing for someone? Maybe some of us have experienced that. We've done something really great for somebody. We've gone out of our way to help them. We've really come through for them. And we don't hear anything. We kind of get forgotten about. That hurts, doesn't it? That's a hurtful thing to experience. Poor Joseph, up, down, up, down, up, down. So Joseph is rotting away in jail, and all of a sudden, Pharaoh starts to have weird dreams. He turns into kind of this Elvis character, and he kind of sings this song, in the musical he sings this song about skinny cows and fat cows and stuff. And Pharaoh is very troubled by these dreams that he's having, and kind of screams at everybody, find someone who can interpret these dreams, and none of his sages and wizards and priests can do anything. And then the cupbearer goes, there's a guy in prison, he can do it. So Joseph gets hauled out of prison and has to stand in front of Pharaoh. And this is a pretty scary thing. Pharaoh at the time is probably the most powerful man in the world, and is able to make something of Joseph or completely extinguish his life, depending on how he feels on that day. And so Joseph has to stand in front of Pharaoh and interprets Pharaoh's dream. So in chapter 41, verse 14, Pharaoh is very happy with what Joseph says. And in verse 14 he said, "You shall be in charge of my palace, and all of my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Wow. That's amazing, right? He has gone from prison to being Pharaoh's number one guy. Like, nobody in the kingdom has more authority than Joseph. That's absolutely amazing. And then the story continues on. There's a famine in Canaan. And guess who turns up in Egypt? Knowing that there's some clever guy in Egypt who's been storing food for the last 7 years, and that Egypt has plenty of food. Yeah, it's his ratbag brothers. And they turn up with their hands out, not realizing that it's Joseph. Can you imagine being Joseph in that situation? Just picture yourself for a second. You have had your life completely and utterly ruined. You have been dehumanized, you've been beaten, you've been dehumanized, you've been sold into slavery, you've been accused of rape, you have had to live in a dingy cell, like probably just a dust floor, probably eating bread and water if you're lucky. You've had all of this happen to you, and you see the people who are responsible for it in front of you. And they want something from you. I mean, I'd be like, oh, you got a nerve. And then it kind of going through his mind, and I have a whole lot of power right now. I have the whole of the Egyptian army at my command. I can make life unbelievably difficult for you guys right now. You have no idea how difficult. I can have your fingernails removed with a spoon if I want. But that's not what Joseph does. That's not what Joseph does. In fact, he shows them compassion. He gives them food. Now he has his little games with them, hiding a cup and getting them accused of stealing and stuff like that. But Joseph doesn't give the brothers what they deserve. And eventually his dad comes to Egypt and there's a big family reunion and stuff like that. But the brothers are still worried because they think that Joseph is only being nice to them because it won't upset his dad. That Jacob won't get upset because, as parents, we always want our kids to get on, don't we? Like, be nice to your brother. I know it's a pain in the backside, but be nice to him, your family. You have to get on. And I think that was the situation that was going on then. Eventually, Jacob dies, and his brothers go into a bit of a panic. And if you go to chapter 15 of Genesis, Jacob's died, and his brothers are very, very scared right now because there's nobody who's able to stand in the way and keep Joseph, this powerful Egyptian ruler, at bay. Verses 20 and 21. Start at verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph's a saint. I mean, I would have had the SAS go and take them off and do all sorts of unspeakable things to them. But Joseph doesn't. And here's the thing, the story of Joseph. There's two important points about the story of Joseph for us to take into consideration. Firstly is this, and you may not like this one, but it's true. Bad things happen to good people. It's a fact of life. Bad things happen to good people. Now, we don't see anywhere recorded that Joseph was a particularly obnoxious character. He was 17, he probably had a few rough edges, and maybe telling everybody about his dreams may have been a little precocious. But he certainly didn't deserve what happened to him. And actually, all the way through the story, we see that Joseph is a good guy. He gets promoted, he keeps given responsibility. Joseph's a nice guy. Yet time and time again, bad things happen. And it's confusing, isn't it? And, we look at perhaps people that we know, and we see them, they're a good person, and why does tragedy after tragedy after tragedy continue to happen to them? And it's a hard question, and it's a question that we shouldn't shy away from asking, because that's the nature of life sometimes. Bad things happen to good people. But here's the real twister in the story of Joseph. Now, we've seen that bad things happen to good people. Here's the real thing that sticks the knife in this story, is that the story of Joseph is that good things happen to bad people as well. Doesn't it just stick in your throat? That after everything that his scumbag brothers had done to him, he then supports them for the rest of his life, and they get to live in a lap of luxury. That they do not have to answer for any of their crimes. Doesn't that stick in your throat just a little bit? In fact, in nowhere does it say that Joseph said, I've forgiven you, but you still have to go to court and you still have to answer for your crimes because what you did was unforgivable. No. They don't even have to answer for their crimes. They get forgiven automatically. And they get precisely what they don't deserve. What they deserved was to be sent back to Canaan and to die a slow and painful death of starvation and thirst. That's what they deserved. Because they were conniving, they were cruel, they were heartless, they thought nothing of the consequences at all. They lied to their dad and watched their dad go through anguish after anguish, day after day, mourning the loss of his beloved son. And then they have the audacity to ask for help. They must have been absolutely terrified the moment they realised who it was they were stood in front of. Because they thoroughly deserved to be taken up, put against the wall, and whatever the equivalent was to being shot in those days, after being tortured slowly and painfully. But that's not what happens in this story. And this is where God's heart is revealed in the story. Talk about an illustration of God's heart of grace at work in a difficult story in the Old Testament. See, in many ways, we're like the brothers, in that we continue to willfully sin. We continue to willfully do our own things our own way, and let's be honest, we've had some pretty inglorious moments in our lives, haven't we? We've done things that none of us are proud of. Yet God's response to us is not that he says, you are going to get what you deserve. So that's the way that society thinks. Society says that if you're good, you should have good things happen to you. If you're bad, you should have bad things happen to you. You get what you deserve. If you work hard, you get this. If you don't work hard, you should get nothing. That's the way that society operates. Think about the whole case that's in the news at the moment, Shamima Begum. You join IS, you're not allowed to be a British citizen anymore, and you should spend your life rotting somewhere else. But she doesn't deserve to come back. She joined a terrorist group and lived there. But that's not God's heart. We don't get what we deserve, and each one of us here should be immensely thankful that we don't. Because the Bible very clearly says this: the wages of sin is death. Each one of us deserves eternal separation from God. And that's the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel is played out in the story of Joseph. And here's the thing, that the story of Joseph teaches us those two things, that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. The fact is that, yeah, bad things do happen to good people. But also what the story of Joseph teaches us, that Joseph was never alone. Each time God came through for him, and God had a plan that was above and beyond the situation that he found himself in. And even if Joseph had died in prison from cholera, God's purpose would have still come through. God's purpose would have been found, and that God would have been glorified. And that even if Joseph had spent his days in jail and rotted away in jail, one day Joseph would have received freedom when he came to face his Maker God. And this is the message of the gospel, is that human existence can sometimes be miserable. It can be hard, and bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen time and time again to good people sometimes. You know, we all know those people, don't we? How can they go through so many things in such a short space of time? But that's the way that life is. But the message of the gospel is that that is never in vain. Is that God's purpose will always be seen and discovered, even through human suffering. And that what Satan meant to destroy us, God meant to bring life and goodness, and for his name to be glorified. And if God is glorified ultimately, if God is glorified through human suffering, and we see that in the life of Jesus, that he suffered indescribable pain, yet God was glorified, and our salvation was won by the suffering of Jesus. So it's good for us to look at this story in the Old Testament. It's good for us to be reminded that no matter what suffering you and I go through, no matter what trials and tribulations we go through, God is always with us. And even if we have to spend our days in some jail pit somewhere, God never leaves us or forsakes us. And that he will be glorified in our lives. And even if we die in jail, then that death is not the end for us. And that when we die, we are raised to life to be with him. And that we get to live eternity free of sin and pain and suffering. And we get to be with Jesus the rest of our days. That's amazing. That's something that should never be understated. The story is also that good things happen to bad people, and each one of us here should be incredibly grateful that good things happen to bad people. Because if we live according to the rules of karma, which says you only get what you deserve, then we would all have a pretty miserable existence. And Jesus didn't come to bring karma. Jesus came to bring grace. And that we get what we don't deserve. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful for that. So, I hope you've been able to see this morning about how God's heart is revealed in this story. It's an amazing and touching story. It's a challenging story. But one that should give us hope. Shall we pray? God, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you never change. And that you are the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. And we thank you for the way that you continue to be with Joseph, even when he was in the jail cell, you were with him when he was promoted, you were there with him when he was accused of rape, you were there when he was made Pharaoh's number one. You continued to be with him, and you did a work in his heart which meant that when his brothers turned up, he didn't give them what they deserved, modelling your heart for your creation. So God, we thank you for that. We pray that that we would, as recipients of grace, that we would continue in our daily lives to be grace givers. That we would, those times when we're tempted to give people what they deserve, and that we'd be reminded that we don't get what we deserve. And God, I pray that that we would be able to be a people, individuals who are full of grace, and let your grace and your truth and your love flow out from our lives. We pray this in your name. Amen. We're going to finish with a song together. Seems like an appropriate one. Amazing Grace. Let's start.